we share a continent with a country that we aren't, and yet we love and that we also hate. Even to talk of integration, even to say that people should, try to adopt Canadian values, that's somehow racist.
Well, you criticized someone like Mark Carney, for instance. I'm just going to read this portion of your article. The challenge for any new national liberal...
Let me clarify that. I don't think we should be proud of owning slaves. That's exactly not what I mean. But when you look at the history of slavery across the world, Canada's place in that is pretty minimal.
Christopher Dummitt is a historian, an author, and professor known for his sharp analysis of Canadian politics, the history and culture. He is a leading voice on political traditions and national identity. He has written extensively on power, on governance, and the shift in values in Canadian society. He is a vocal and compelling voice of reason. He's someone every Canadian should hear in today's shifting socio-cultural and political landscape. So let's start like this. The Canadian society, looking at the present situation of things, often look like it's shrouded in American lifestyle, the politics, media, and even way of life. I know we are from the same continent, but we find a lot of times that the Canadian voice is not amplified and unique enough. Is that a new thing, or is it a thing that comes from the past based on your work?
It's not new at all. It's amplified by the hyper-mediated age in which we live. I mean, I'm assigning a class I teach in the 1960s, my students, this book, Lament for a Nation, published back in the mid-1960s by this great Canadian philosopher, George Grant. And the mid-1960s, he's saying Canada's dead. He's lamenting this nation, which is going to continue to exist in form, but really it's lost. And, part of what he was saying is part of, I think, what you're getting at, is the idea that there's something distinctly unique about Canada, which can withstand the assault of being on a continent with a nation 10 times as large. But not just that, also which just saturates the world's and certainly Canada's cultural system, our news idea, our interests. That maybe even more than that. Like what Canadians are actually interested in. We're interested and fascinated by America, and we're so close to them. And so on a bunch of levels, we share a continent with a country that we aren't, and yet we love and that we also hate. And it makes the idea of Canada, it makes living as Canadians very, very distinct. And so everyone in the world, to a certain extent, shares this, the pressure of and the lure of American culture. But certainly for English Canadians, less so for French Canadians. We're just the closest to the beast.
So what do you think is responsible for that? And do you think it's getting worse compared to 1960? If somebody said in 1960s that Canada is dead, you say, right? I wonder what we should say right now about Canada.
I have two thoughts which are opposite about this.
Okay.
I think clearly, in the current context, we're talking, it's about Donald Trump, the pretty now open threat of a claim to Canada, whether it's serious or not for Canada to become the 51st state, the economic tariffs that could just do incredible damage to the Canadian economy. So that threat is worse maybe than it's been in a long time. But in terms of Canadian culture, I think the fact that you and I are sitting here and talking in a YouTube podcast, and you've created this podcast, I'm not sure when you started, but out of nothing. And I think that idea of the social media age gives just incredible opportunities for Canadians to create their own culture, which is what you're doing, what many people are doing. And that actually is a way of kind of subverting what was a very staid kind of Hollywood system, television system, which kind of controls culture. So there's opportunities for a kind of proliferation of Canadianness all over the place for individual kind of Canadians to make culture and to get it to Canadians.
So I've always wondered actually what the true Canadian culture is. And I think more and more we hear from government saying that, this is what Canadians like. Not to get into politics right away, but I hear someone like Trudeau saying, Canadians are nice. Canadians want fairness. Canadians want this. And when I get on the street, most times what people want actually differ from what I hear on media. So I've always wondered, apart from, say, King Abdullah in Nova Scotia or Putin, what's the real Canadian culture going from history?
I mean, it's hard to identify one thing, and I think obviously it's got to have a diversity of experiences. I've been on Down Air Corner, Pizza Corner in Halifax. I've also enjoyed that. The Trudeau version is a particular post-1960s liberal vision of Canada. It's rooted in his dad's vision of Canada, this kind of liberal, continental, individual rights, increasingly progressive, but what progressive means has changed quite drastically over that, 50, 60 years since that vision has come into place. And so when people speak about Canada, the current Trudeau government, or not Trudeau government anymore, has a vision of a certain vision of Canada. George Grant, when he's writing in the mid-1960s, he's saying there was an English Canada, but also maybe more broadly a kind of small c conservative vision of Canada, which was there for at least 100, 150 years, which is that we weren't Americans. We hadn't gone the revolutionary path. We had adopted life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? Instead, Canadians had peace, order, and good government. That's the expression from our Constitution, which is to say, we're not going to be the wild, crazy, independent Americans. We're going to be slightly more staid, slightly more cautious, rooted in our traditions. That vision of Canada, which lasted until the 1960s, is quashed in some sense by the Trudeau vision of Canada. It's quashed by continentalism, and it's quashed by multiculturalism, or a certain reading of multiculturalism anyway. When you say, what is the Canada? In some ways, there isn't a kind of, that isn't a grand vision. There are competing visions. Although I feel like if you got down to speaking to people across the country, I would think that there would be a shared commitment to a certain notion of a rights culture. Right. I think which is, we might have different visions of that. I think is clear. A shared commitment to a kind of cultural tolerance across the country. A shared commitment to not being American. And there'd be a bunch of other things that you would get there. But it's tricky because especially our cultural producers, our cultural elite, differ fundamentally on the vision that they want to sell.
Yeah, so you mentioned in passing the issue of multiculturalism that's in our constitution, and I compare it with the philosophy for living in the American system, for instance, where they talk about the pursuit of happiness, and I think that inherently means the economic potential or prosperity of individuals and the system. We don't have anything like that in our constitution, neither in our philosophy for living. I don't think we're looking at a grand thing to be done, like the American way. And on one hand, we call them the bully Americans, coming from an African background. But there's a good thing in it. There's an inherently good thing in that pursuit of happiness, pursuit of excellence. Everything they do is big. If they make a car, it's big, it drives fast, too much power. No, those fine details. But we don't have that in the Canadian culture.
The vision was, until through the 60s, and there are still some people you'll find who believe this. The vision was, I call it the POG Canada, peace, order, and good government. It is that we were different. Canada was different because we didn't break from our traditions. We didn't have a revolution. French Canada maintained their cultural traditions. British Canada, English Canada, pick the moment when Canada becomes independent. You ask Canadians, most Canadians won't have an idea because it happens at so many different points. That was the Canadian story, that we embraced our link to the past, even as we asserted our kind of independent stance within North America. We're Canadians. We're not those British. We don't, when we're fighting the First World War, we want to say we're not the British tough officers. But we also embrace the fact that we'd taken a different path in North America. We'd stayed true to our traditions. And that's what made us different from the Americans. And that's a kind of vision of Canada which was so powerful and has been, in many respects discarded.
Let me follow up on this, Jude. What do you think about the clause about multiculturalism, especially when you compare it side by side, the modern definition of multiculturalism? Let's also take reference from the past. Do you think this is actually helpful to a present day Canadian culture?
I think it depends what you mean by multiculturalism. I think multiculturalism, which means an openness to immigrants from around the world, a kind of openness to the immigration system, which is set up in the 1960s. That's quite deliberately saying we're not going to make race an issue, right? We're not going to make what it's called country of origin, really is how it was in the system before, right? Pierre Trudeau stands up in the House of Commons in 1971 and announces the multiculturalism policy. He stands up and says there's not going to be one official culture. We have a country with two official languages, but we're not going to have one official culture. And I think there's on the one hand this openness to the world, but there's a tension there, which is to say, does this openness to everyone in the world mean that there there can't be a Canadian culture, and that there can't be this thing called being Canadian, if except to say that we're diverse. And I think that creates a tension in Canada, because it makes it hard to say to new immigrants, no, there is this thing that we have in Canada with certain values we have and aspire towards, which I think many people would agree with. But it opens up the idea that asking an immigrant to embrace any kind of Canadian tradition is potentially a kind of disloyal to the idea of multiculturalism. So there's this tension, this kind of openness, but also this possibility that maybe it means that there is no official culture.
Right. So do you think multiculturalism is actually a sustainable philosophy for
For our country.
country?
One of my kind of intellectual heroes, a guy named Eugene Forcy, I think he called Canada a kind of a collection of shopping malls. By this point, under Pierre Trudeau, even though he liked Pierre Trudeau in some respects, I think it depends what you mean is sustainable. I think if you assume in the one version of multiculturalism that there is no Canadianness, that to speak of Canada as having a culture is somehow discriminatory, then I don't think that's sustainable. There's no counter argument to then why we wouldn't just join the United States. But if you assume that there's another version of multiculturalism, which is to say, we're going to be open to the world, we're going to embrace the possibilities of bringing the best and the brightest from around the world to enrich our country, and do this in a non-discriminatory way, that's a vision of multiculturalism and a vision of Canada which is much more sustainable and much more growable.
I think even if you open up your arms to the rest of the world in the spirit of multiculturalism, it should be directed towards an integration. In recent times, I've actually talked about this on the podcast in different monologues, and I've nursed this thought that actually one of the things we see in modern day immigration in Canada, I've lived here for 10 years. So really, I'm going by the reference of 10 years. I've done myself a good amount of reading as well about Canadian history. I got myself a book, Canadian History for Dummies. Not to say I'm a dummy, but I
It's a good start.
I think so. I wouldn't get involved in any argument going by the book, but it's a good start, like you said. But when you look at the issue of integration and the tendency that if immigrants from different cultures bringing this diverse experience into a nation like Canada do not integrate into something meaningful, something defined, we could have ghettoization and different cultural enclaves in the nation, which I think is what we're having right now. You find areas where crimes are thriving, and you look in that area, there's a specific nationality to that area. I think I will fault multiculturalism defined in that sense, wouldn't you?
I think so. The critique of multiculturalism you're talking about has been around since multiculturalism has existed, right? It's the sense that you give up the idea that people should be integrating to society, and I don't think that's actually what Pierre Trudeau meant in 1971. Which is interesting. I would say the problem is less to do with non-integration. I think over time there's a desire to be part of the new society. I think that kind of naturally comes. The fault in the system, as I see it, and maybe this is me living in the university world, is that there are, I have colleagues who write books and articles and are experts on topics who say even to talk of integration, even to say that people should, try to adopt Canadian values, that's somehow racist and somehow discriminatory. The idea that you would want new immigrants to, slowly call themselves Canadian and lose touch over the generations with where they came from, that's somehow discriminatory. And you find this in a lot of the academic literature on this. I think that is more the problem. I think generation upon generation, people are going to want to be part of the society. The fault, if it's a fault, is that a significant portion of our elite intellectual culture and political culture sees even talking about these things as potentially discriminatory. That, I would say, is the problem.
Right. We're going to revisit the issue of academia in how that affects policies, because I know you wrote about it and you've talked about it in the floor of the Senate recently, but we're going to get back to it. There's something else I want us to talk about here, and it's tied to the current conversation that we just had about multiculturalism, about immigration. Again, I came to Canada 10 years ago. I went to school, a master's and a doctorate. One of the things that education within a system, a host country like this, does to people is it helps with integration. I think of late the whole issue with LMI scam and whatnot, and PRs coming directly into Canada. Actually, I find it does not help with integration. And I'll give the reason why I say that. A lot of times, like we said earlier, even the democratic system of Canada is shrouded in the democratic system in America, which is the presidential system. So a lot of times people don't actually understand what we mean when we say a parliamentary system of government. And I know you talked about that with in passing with Michel Ferrari in your conversation of late as well. Let's actually put the systems side by side. We run a parliamentary system of government. The Americans run a presidential system of government. People say the parliamentary is the oldest form of government and is a more reliable system of government.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so the president sits in the center. The prime minister sits in the center.
Sort of.
How do you mean?
Well, depends what you mean by the center. Actually, in the crown, the monarch is in the center.
Right.
In a parliamentary system, but they kind of have this place in the center where they don't take up a lot of space. But the idea that that the head of our government, like the head of the American government, head of the American government is the president. Right. The head of the Canadian government is actually the king. I mean, this is an issue not just for immigrants, but for many Canadians. The failure to kind of continually talk about that and acknowledge that is one of the reasons why we don't understand our political system. When you talk about it, you get a lot of anti-monarchist kind of rhetoric, which, to the extent that it means we shouldn't have a monarch at the head of our system controlling things, I would agree with. But it's a failure to understand the nature of parliamentary democracy, that we have over hundreds of years in our tradition, which goes back to Britain, essentially increasingly hemmed in the powers of the monarch and the crown so that they really are a symbol of the nation now. They don't have any real power, and we don't want them to have any power because we're a modern democracy. But they stand at the center of our system, showing kind of two things. One, that they represent the whole nation, right? So it's not just we have, His Majesty's government. We also have His Majesty's loyal opposition. And the idea is that our government, the head of our government, is not someone who is a member of a party, but just kind of represents our traditions. And everyone, you can have one party come into power, they'll leave. Another first party comes into power, and it's important not to have a political figure at the top of our system of government, right? That's one thing. And then the other thing is that in a way that Canadians forget about, and our governments are to blame for helping us to forget about this, is that it links us to centuries of history where people have tried and modified and created this system of parliamentary democracy since Anglo-Saxon England. And we're the inheritors of those traditions. And our school system should be teaching us as the inheritors of those traditions. We should be teaching, the English Civil Wars of the 17th century as Canadian history because they are Canadian history. So our system of government is centuries and centuries old, a millennia old. And we have a version of this which exists in 2025, in which the monarch's role is very limited, but it links us back to that incredibly important history.
I think that's a richness of history. Yeah, well, but a lot of times these days we want to forget about our history, especially when we get to the portions in our history that talks about slavery and injustice in the past. We want to really isolate ourselves from it, like, oh, that never happened.
But we should actually be very proud of our history and our connection to slavery, because slavery was rampant throughout the world. And slavery, I mean, let me clarify that. I don't think we should be proud of owning slaves. That's exactly not what I mean. But when you look at the history of slavery across the world, Canada's place in that is pretty minimal in the sense that there were relatively very few slaves. They didn't play a large economic role in our culture, in our society, in our economy. Doesn't mean they didn't exist. They did exist for a period of time. But Canada's and Britain's place in the history of slavery is as one of the earliest places to outlaw slavery. Long after, and long before Canada had slaves, other groups had slaves. And this is often the really misunderstood aspect of it, right? There was slave owning amongst Indigenous peoples in North America, widespread, especially on the Pacific Northwest, and then different forms of captive slave taking amongst Indigenous peoples in the area we live in now. So when people talk about history of slavery, they often don't talk about that, but they should. And there was slavery which existed, in Africa before the Atlantic slave trade, in different variations of this. The Ottoman Empire, incredible, which was taking African slaves up through the Middle East before and after the Atlantic slave trade. Anyway, I could go on about this, but I think the problem with understanding Canada's role in slavery is that we've got this very Americanized idea of what slavery is, which is rooted in kind of chattel slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, and in which, they fight a civil war over. But, Canada's role in the history of slavery is that we didn't have a lot of slavery, and early on, a lot of Canadians and British Canadians said that we shouldn't have slaves. That we were kind of stand out as one of these places which got rid of slavery earlier and more effectively than almost anywhere else in the world.
Right. Let's move away a little bit from slavery. Still talk about that topic. I think I can revisit this, but I think we can go on and on about it for a very long time. Still in our systems of government, just to educate the people out there, because I find there's a missing gap in knowledge here. I spend a lot of time actually reading about the system here because I want to understand where I live. I want to know what happens around me, what's shaping the policies. But a lot of Canadians actually don't care about that. You talk about the head of government here being the king, the head of government in the presidential system being the president. Now let's look at the arms of government in parliamentary compared to the presidential system. You have the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative. Let's compare them. You have executive in presidential, which is the president. And then you have the legislative, which is the House. And you have the judiciary, which is
Sorry, judiciary, you said?
yeah,
Well, the judiciary, the courts in the
the
American
court.
system, but they also have the Senate and the Congress, and yeah.
Exactly. How does that compare? How does it stack against the parliamentary system of government?
Yeah, so the American system is based on a kind of what the phrase that is often talked about is checks and balances. So the Senate, all three elements have to pass a bill. Whether it's the president has to sign it, the Congress and the Senate, and then of course the judiciary can review it later. And they're all trying to check each other to make sure there's no abuse of power. The Canadian system is not that. We have what's called a system of responsible government, which means, and everyone always misunderstands what this means, it means that our executive, which is the prime minister and their cabinet, right? So our executive is the prime minister's cabinet. That's kind of the government. It's His Majesty's government, right? The moment, well, it's still Trudeau, but there's no real leader there, and the cabinet. But they have to hold the confidence of the House of Commons. They have to hold the confidence of Parliament. So it's not separated out. There's a direct link down into Parliament. And if the Prime Minister and their government hold the confidence of Parliament, they have a lot of power to do things, right? It's very clear that they can do a lot of things. They have, in fact, way more power than an American president has, and legitimately wielding that power, because we know that when we voted in an election, we voted in all these members of Parliament, and the people we voted into Parliament are saying, we support this government. And we're going to, between 4 or 5 years, constitutionally it's 5 years, although there's been these laws which say we should hold it every 4 years, but constitutionally it should be every 5 years. We're going to check that. We're going to go back to the people, and we're going to have a new election. Say, now vote in new members of Parliament. And are they going to have which government are they going to support? Who's going to be the prime minister amongst those people? The benefit of that parliamentary system compared to the American system is that while that prime minister who holds the confidence of Parliament does things, we know we know what they're doing, and we can hold them accountable. So Justin Trudeau did a lot of things while in power, maybe early, somewhat popular, maybe controversial things, legalizing marijuana, or, negotiating a new NAFTA, or, whatever the bills they pass. Now, when there's another election, Canadians know who to call to account, right? Their members of Parliament have supported that government. If they don't like what that government has done, you vote for another party and you get a new government, because you know exactly who's been responsible for the laws. In the American system, who knows who's responsible, right? Maybe with a president, if they sign presidential orders, that's pretty clear. But often budget bills are horse trading between Congress, between Senate, between the president. There's a whole maelstrom of trade-offs and compromises, and we don't have that in the Canadian system. I think that's a real benefit, because we know who should be held to account, and we can say, okay, this time we're going to give you somewhat free rein if you get a majority in Parliament. But if you don't have a majority in Parliament, we're going to hold you to account, right, as well.
So the accountability structure is that the House holds the executive
Yes.
accountable.
Yeah.
What about the Senate? The Senate is actually ceremonial, not ceremonial.
The Senate is, they call it the House of Sober Second Thought. The Senate is mostly not very relevant, and was designed to mostly not be too relevant.
Okay.
It's when Canada's Constitution gets written up in the early mid-1860s. It's being written up by people who had just won responsible government in the 1840s and 1850s. So they just won the power to have their legislatures control the government, and they weren't about to go hand it to a Senate. So they said, the Senate, we see a usefulness for this in kind of reviewing legislation, having some input, and also, frankly, to be a place where you can reward party loyalists to give them positions of authority. And there's some usefulness. But the main source of power in our system is the House of Commons, and that's what the founders believed it should be.
So really, what's the role of the Senate in 2025?
In 2025, could you get rid of it entirely? Possibly. It'll be pretty hard to do constitutionally. I'd say the best you can say is that the Senate, and I think sometimes in practice this does happen. They carefully scrutinize legislation to kind of see minor problems and fix those minor problems. And on rare occasions, when a government is legislating on something that might be very unpopular in the broader country. So even though the government has a majority in the House, maybe they've been in power for a few years, an issue is really unpopular, there's a possibility for the Senate to say, let's think about this, and they send it back. Now, the Senate can't ultimately reject a bill, then they can send it back a few times to the House.
Right.
But it's a kind of cautionary rule for the Senate to say, well, you better think about this. What about these changes?
Yeah, and these are appointed by the prime minister.
That's right, yeah.
So I wouldn't call that an accountability structure to the executive.
Not in some ways keeping the government accountable, but it's not a democratic accountability structure. That's for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at we'll compare them now: the House and presidential, the Senate and the presidency, and then here the prime minister, the Senate and the House of Commons. What about the role of the Governor General? I know that's also appointed by the prime minister to the crown, and that the crown installs that. But what's the role of the Governor General within the system?
Mostly ceremonial, like almost entirely ceremonial, in the sense that they are the crown's representative in Canada. His Majesty's representative in Canada.
All right.
And so their practical role is to give out awards and to meet foreign heads of state and dignitaries, because they are the representative of the head of state in Canada. There are a few reserve powers, and these are kind of becoming controversial because of, I think, things we're going to talk about the prorogation of Parliament. The Prime Minister has to go to the Governor General to sort of say, can we dissolve or prorogue Parliament to hold a new election? And the Governor General is supposed to follow the advice of the Prime Minister. There's disagreement among experts on if the Governor General can refuse a Prime Minister in certain circumstances. I'm one of those people who thinks in very rare circumstances, the Governor General has a role to reject a Prime Ministerial advice. But there are others who disagree, but I would say my reading of that is rooted in a truer understanding of the Westminster style system of government.
All right. So the role of the Governor General is mostly founded in when issues like the one we currently have in government happen. Otherwise, it's a ceremonial role.
Yeah.
So really, it's the Governor General who can really, to a great extent, determine if a prime minister stays in power, especially in this kind of situation.
Only in very rare circumstances, right? Because normally the people with the voice to say whether a prime minister should stay in office are parliamentarians. It's the House of Commons. And when they vote non-confidence in the government, they're saying we don't have confidence in you. When they keep passing bills, then they're saying we have confidence in the government. The unique situation that happened in early January was that the Prime Minister went to the Governor General and said, can we prorogue Parliament? Which kind of shuts down the whole legislative session until sometime in March. And normally that should be uncontroversial. A prime minister is just saying we want to pause Parliament and we want to start up a new session in a few months. Normally, the Governor General's role is to completely accept that. The Governor General has no reason to disagree unless it's going past the period of time in which we would normally have an election. The difference in this case is that the reason Trudeau went to ask for prorogation is that he was going to resign and he wanted to give opportunity for the Liberal Party to elect a new leader. But also, and this is the most important thing, over the Christmas holidays from mid-December through the end of the year, all of the leaders of the other parties in Parliament had said that they no longer had confidence in the government. In my mind, the Governor General made a significant mistake there, because the Governor General knew, or at least had reason to believe, that the government, the Prime Minister did not have the confidence of Parliament. Parliament was set to resume in January. The Governor General should have said, listen, it seems like you don't have the confidence of Parliament. I don't want to say no to you, but why don't you go back to Parliament, meet for a very limited session, and let's find out if this is true or not. Maybe Jagmeet Singh and maybe Pierre Poilievre wouldn't vote down the government. But the Governor General had, very clear and very good reason to believe that the Prime Minister did not enjoy the confidence of Parliament. And that is the central feature of our system of government, of responsible government. They have to have the confidence of Parliament. So in my mind, it was a fundamental error for the Governor General to allow that prorogation to take place.
Could it be in part because she was thinking that it could lead to chaos in governance if he didn't have the confidence, or Trudeau didn't have the confidence of Parliament anymore? And there's already a hugely overwhelming dissatisfaction in public in the current administration. Do you think that's sufficient reason to have approved the prorogation?
No, I think the reason they should be advised to accept the prorogation was, the one hand, that it's only in very rare circumstances that a Governor General could ever, not follow a Prime Minister's advice. It would be anti-democratic. We wouldn't want a governor general to kind of not follow the prime minister's advice, usually. So I think that is the main reason. And she's probably convinced that it was only for a few months. And so the timing wasn't too far. It wasn't for 6 months or a year. It was a couple of months. And so that probably seemed reasonable. And then also for the reason for the dissolution was that it was give the Liberals time to choose a new leader, and then that leader would come to Parliament and we'd find out, if Parliament supported the government. So I think that's the best case scenario for why she did what she did. But as I say, given that she had reason to think that at that moment, the Parliament did not have confidence in the government, we have a situation where there was a new American president coming in, threatening incredible economic sanctions against Canada. So with pretty severe consequences for Canada, putting off an election for 2.5 months, but putting off the government facing Parliament for 2.5 months is a pretty significant decision to make. And I think it would have been much wiser to say, okay, you're going to meet Parliament. We're going to see if Parliament supports you. If Parliament supports you, then that's fine. It's not controversial. But if Parliament doesn't support you, then you shouldn't be in government.
So what could have happened is if Parliament does not support him, they would have elected.
Yeah, they just you would instantly go to a new election. He would. Sorry, I'm trying to get the right of this. There would be he would still be prime minister until there was a new election, or unless the Parliament then found a new leader. I'm trying to think if it's an interim leader. I have to think about the specifics of exactly who was prime minister over that moment in time.
So let me play the devil's advocate here. And I know people will ask this kind of questions in the comment section. You wrote about this in your article as well, which I'm going to tag in the description for this video. You called it unconstitutional, the way she agreed to prorogue Parliament. But Harper's administration also had Parliament prorogued in 2008. I read about this. I wasn't living in Canada till But how does that compare? Is this a precedent that you think this current administration
I think the Harper president was a bad precedent, and it probably was set there. This did happen in 2008,
right,
when there had just been an election in the fall. Harper was reelected, although with a minority parliament, like the current Trudeau government, so they didn't have a majority in the House. And, again, there was a pretty significant international climate at that time. There's an economic crisis that hadn't been clear at the beginning of the election cycle, but after the election cycle, it was clear that the international economic crisis was going to change things. And the three opposition party leaders of the Liberals, the NDP, and controversially the Bloc Québécois came together and they signed an agreement, and they held up this sheet of paper at a press conference that said, we're going to vote out the Harper government and we're going to agree to form a kind of coalition government. That may have been politically stupid to agree to sign a government deal with the Bloc Québécois that doesn't really believe Canada should exist, but it was entirely constitutional. That government, if it had been allowed to form, would have represented a majority in Parliament. They would have had the confidence of Parliament, and that's what matters in our system. In that case, the Governor General kind of allowed a prorogation over, I believe it was the Christmas break, and in the interim, the Liberals decided to change their mind, right? And they got rid of their leader, Stéphane Dion, and they chose a new leader who then decided, we're not going to tear up that agreement. In actual practice, I would say Harper should not have been allowed to prorogue, because the purpose of his prorogation wasn't the normal, we're going to pause things to kind of reset. It was to flee the scrutiny of Parliament. The Governor General had every reason to believe, very firm reason to believe, that Parliament did not have confidence in the government. They absolutely should have been forced to go and face Parliament to see whether that was the case. But actually, the current example is even more egregious, because at least in that case, there'd just been an election, right? And so you could at least say, we just had an election, so it's pretty clear that Canada's divided. They weren't going to give anyone a majority. Still, I don't think it was a good reason. But in this case, we're years from an election in a minority government. There's every reason to go and, make the government face Parliament. And if they don't have confidence in the government, then having a new election, which was bound to happen later this year anyway.
So in that case, who checks the power of the Governor General? And I know I'm going to loop here in the structure of this accountability.
Officially, no. It's custom and tradition, which is the nature of our system of government. We have a series of customs and traditions, and that's part of our Canadian, British-style parliamentary constitution. Some of our constitution is written down, and some of our constitution are a series of precedents.
So do you think that's dangerous?
Normally, no. And I think there's some scrutiny of the Governor General's decision. Are we talking about kind of Canada turning into a dictatorship? No, I don't think you need to worry about that. But I think what we're doing here, this conversation, I know that there's a lawsuit about this situation, about the prorogation. I think these are ways of kind of speaking back to the Governor General's decision and hopefully informing a future Governor General that this is not the appropriate response to take.
Right. Are you following up on the lawsuit, by the way? You talked about it recently as well.
Yeah, well, I've been in touch with the people who are setting it in motion, and I'm interested in what happens. I'm wary of courts getting too involved in, overturning government decisions. I'm very wary of that kind of thing in general. But I think in this case, given that the courts would be, if they were to intervene and say that the governor generals, I think it's based on the prime minister's advice. If they were to intervene, then it would basically be to support parliamentary powers. So I'm more reassured that it's about that.
I'm certain you're enjoying this conversation right now and you can't wait to get back into it. But permit me to hold you for a second here. More than 95% of the viewers on the channel haven't subscribed yet. And it goes a long way in helping the channel. But if you can click on the subscribe button right now, it will go a long way in helping to improve the quality of the work on the channel and the quality of guests that you see on this channel every time. Please do me that favor, click on the subscribe button. I want to achieve 20% subscriber to viewer count this time.
Right. So it's interesting that no one checks the power of the governor general. To me, I find that interesting because I kept thinking about it, especially since I saw your article about it, which I again recommend that people read that. But I look at both systems of government, presidential and parliamentary. And I know this is sounding like a government for kindergarten, the way I'm approaching this conversation, but we'll see where this leads us in this conversation. But when I compare the two, in recent experiences, we had a Joe Biden who just exited office, right, in the United States, and we have a Justin Trudeau. They kind of have similarities, at least in my own mind. Biden should have exited office way before the end of his term. I think for his cognitive decline and even the state of the economy and many other factors. I think especially because of his cognitive decline, he should have exited office. But that was covered up in my own opinion. We come also to Canada. I think in some ways it sounds like the Canadians' problem is actually more of a sabotage on the people, which I think also someone like Trudeau he would have actually had almost a glorious exit if he didn't call an election in 2021. He would have been described as the prime minister who had the greatest economic recovery in the century from COVID, but he decided to call an early election. And here we are now, Canadians feel stuck with this guy. And I say that because I'm going by comments on my YouTube videos, comments on Twitter when I go there. People are disgruntled. Over 70% of Canadians don't want this guy anymore, right? He's stepped aside. But I look at those two, and it frustrates me looking at the democratic system of government. And I say that carefully because I've also lived under dictatorship governments before. I know the alternative is never good compared to democratic systems. But do you find that this kind of issues is really disturbing in our time?
You mean, well, I find it disturbing. I think you'd have to be pretty clear, as you said at the end there, that it's quite different than being in a dictatorship, right? Where
Right.
we're talking in the case for Trudeau that a delay a certain amount of time. There has to be an election, by the end of this year, or maybe at the very most by the end of next year. So in Canadian systems, you're always talking about there's going to be an election, and the voters will have their say to see who they want to put in parliament. I think behind the scenes, what concerns me about the Canadian case is the inability, but I think unwillingness of Liberal members of Parliament to hold their leader to account. If we had a system, if we lived in a country where even members of Parliament understood parliamentary democracy better and were incentivized to care about that, then they would have done a much better job of holding Trudeau to account. What I mean by that is, it's pretty clear that even as Liberal poll numbers plummeted, even as the popularity rating for Trudeau plummeted, Trudeau was still able, for whatever reason, to keep a bunch of Liberal MPs on side for hopes to maybe get a final cabinet appointment, to hang on to power for a certain amount of time. It's a contrast with what happened in the case of the Conservatives when the members of Parliament decided that they didn't want the former leader Aaron O'Toole, right? And they were able to, as parliamentary members, say, okay, we're going to invoke this thing from the Chong, Michael Chong Reform Act to say we're going to review our leadership. We're not happy with our leadership. We're going to get rid of him, and then we're going to get a new leader. That's what should have happened in the Trudeau case probably last year in 2024. The fact that it didn't happen, it suggests that as I say, the Liberal MPs were incentivized in the wrong way, and that they don't really understand their important role in government to hold even their own prime minister to account.
Yeah, and if I remember well from one of your articles that I read on National Post, I read almost all your articles.
Oh,
by the
no,
way.
that's too much reading.
Well, there's a way I read them. I read from Microsoft Edge. I put it on read loud and then put the earphones on.
Okay.
I get through it quickly. But if I hear something that's interesting, then I go back to, what did I write there? Yeah, you wrote about that. The liberals had the power, but they could use it. I think this was last year when you were talking about this in July or so. But you said if only they would seize that
Yeah.
power to use it.
Yeah, if they were unwilling to risk their own jobs, right? Because maybe there's two things, right? The surest way to get Trudeau to power was to vote non-confidence in their own government, right? And then they risk their own jobs. That's one thing. But also, Canadian parties have moved away from a system of electing leaders where the members of parliament do that. And our tradition in parliamentary systems is to have the members of parliament choose leaders. And we've, for a long time, we've gone away and had these conventions and then elections. And what that does, I would argue, is it diminishes accountability. It allows leaders to stay in power long after that they should be forced to leave. What I would recommend now is that maybe political parties, if they want to exist in Canada, they have the system where they want to engage the broader public. They want to sell memberships or sell the various things or bring people in to vote for a leader. But they should be obliged to have a kind of emergency, an emergency leadership review thing, which can be done by members of parliament, because this would solve the dilemma that those Liberal MPs faced, right? It would follow the traditions we have, which is to say that, the real leaders in parliament should be supported or not supported by those members of parliament. The Michael Chong Reform Act of a number of years ago that was put in sort of did this, and that's how the Conservatives use. These members of parliament should be able to sort of say to Justin Trudeau, we don't have confidence in you. We don't want you as leader. But because the way Trudeau was elected, it gave him this legitimacy where he'd say, well, I wasn't elected by you. I was elected by all these other Canadians or invite, with Trudeau's case, non-Canadians even possibly. And it diminished his accountability.
And speaking about elected by non-Canadians, I remember now that I saw in the news recently that some of the internal constitution of the Liberal Party was changed. That immigrants of, I think, 14 years now
Yeah.
can also vote in the next prime minister. I saw that on the National Post.
Yeah, so I'm not up on the current changes. I think the Liberal Party tightened it up for this current race because there were all these, I think, pretty substantiated claims that non-Canadians were brought in, were bussed into some Liberal nomination ridings. Maybe not just Liberal nomination ridings, where candidates would bus in people, say of Chinese students who would come in to then become, members or supporters of a party and vote for candidates. I don't think Canadians really want that. So I think the Liberals have tightened it up. The age 14 category has been a way in which I think that's pretty standard across political parties in Canada. So in order to be a member of a political party, you don't have to be the voting age of 18. You can be 14.
All right. All right. So we've talked about the system of government, comparing both. We've talked about even the Canadian culture, which I think is very important. It's really important to me, maybe because I come from a very culturally inclined background, and there's a lot of help in it. There's a lot of good things in it, as much as you can also criticize it for all the wars in it as well. But I think the good could really trump the bad a lot of times. But let's not get back to that. We're talking about the Canadian Liberal now, but let's look at Liberal policies. And about this, actually, I would say not necessarily in the sense of the politics, but in the sense of policies, not the Liberal parties around the world. Now, by Liberal parties, I'm talking about here in Canada, maybe in the UK, and even Europe generally, and the Democratic Party also in the United States. When I look at the policies across the spectrum, including even liberal policies from conservatives in the last 10 years, let's say, for instance, or you could even go farther down the lane than that. Inherently, is there anything positive that you find in it? Because I see there's a commonality of problems. You take, for instance, let me qualify this, but you take liberal policies about housing. It's caused inflation in housing in Canada, in the United States, in a place like the UK, even friends in Germany say the same thing. Even in Australia, it's the same problem. You talk about immigration numbers. Even the Conservative Party is to blame partially for that as well. You look at a place like the UK, the number of immigrants they brought in. You look at issues about crime, how tough this government and their policies, and I'm talking about liberal policies again, not necessarily now liberal parties. You talk about crime, you talk about some other social experiments. You mentioned it in passing, issues about drugs, injection sites and whatnot. Even the issue with isolationism from our history and our culture, even our background. Issues also related to, say, energy And balancing that, you mentioned it in one of your articles as well, balancing the need for energy independence and economic growth with protecting the environment. And I think you mentioned another factor in your article, even the diplomacy with indigenous communities. When you look at all of those things, are liberal policies working?
Well, that's a massive question. I'm not going to answer it comprehensively. Let me take a couple of things out of that.
Yes.
I mean, you initially asked me to kind of like steel man the case for the small L liberal policies. What's the positive side of this? I think the vision behind them is ultimately a positive one. I think it's a mistake on the conservative side to see liberals, whatever phrase you want to use for this, as kind of as having nefarious purposes. I think people's political visions are usually positive, and the positive vision is to, one, be very inclusive, right? You want to include everyone. You want to eliminate various exclusionary policies, however you're defining that. Now, I think often it's defined in very radically open ways, which are problematic, but I think that's the vision, right? Initially there. You want to deal with, Canada's growth. You want to open it up to the world. So the Liberal government clearly was won over by the Century Initiative's idea that Canada should grow to 100 million people by 2100. That's great. And it fits in with the idea that Canada should be inclusive. We should have all these people. And to question immigration numbers, even radically expanded immigration numbers, even immigration of, the kinds of immigrants which we really hadn't been taking in, like huge numbers of temporary foreign workers for low-skilled jobs, using international students as pathways to citizenship, that any questioning of that was sort of racist or discriminatory and not just kind of like questioning of it. I think the vision behind that is to be positive, but it's also based on an idea that people can be harmed by lots of things, right? They can be harmed by drug policies, and they can be harmed by criminal code policies that are too harsh. And there's this kind of expanded idea of the individual. It's very fragile, open to harm, open to discrimination, and you want to protect that person. That's the positive vision of a series of liberal political initiatives. What I would suggest is that seemingly positive vision is, when it's been, put on steroids, and when it's been removed from the kinds of normal checks and balances that would normally be put on it, is done incredible harm to Canada in a variety of ways. I think one of the columns I wrote recently that you were maybe referring to is when I said I was trying to explain why I think the next Liberal leader is going to have a tough challenge. Why I think because they've come to stand in for a kind of almost like a kind of a reigning orthodoxy in contemporary Canada, which is to say, well, yes, but yes, we'd like to do that, but fill in the yes, we'd like to deal with crime on our streets. Yes, we'd like to deal with this problem of people getting out on bail and committing murder and rape and all these kinds of problems. But we'll think about these possible other concerns we have about this. And I think that kind of thing has expanded so dramatically and has had such a profound impact on just a host of areas of our culture. And I think this is one of the things that Pierre Poilievre just picked up on naturally, is to say we need to get rid of the gatekeepers, the people who are constantly preventing us from progressing on policies that a host of Canadians would agree on. And whether that's I'm trying to think of different examples of this, whether that's to prevent us from having, downtowns in our cities that are just filled with drug addicts who are, literally, injecting drugs on the street and making everyone feel uncomfortable, but also putting people in danger and putting themselves in danger, really. To other things about economic growth, right? To sort of say we need to build more houses. Well, what about local regulations? What about this? We need to build. We'd like to have a robust economy. Well, we can't be certainly can't build a pipeline. Even though I bet you we'd like to have some more pipelines in Canada right now with these American threats. I think the kind of unchecked growth of a certain liberal way of thinking of the world, small liberal way of thinking of the world, has just led to all of these, a host of unintended consequences that we're all now struggling with and that are frustrating Canadians, in a bunch of different respects.
So maybe it's time for liberal policies, whichever party is adopting it now. And again, I'm not really concerned about party right now as much as the policies themselves. Maybe it's time to go back to the drawing board and begin to evaluate, are these really working? And in fact, do people want and support these policies? Because I think there is a problem that we have. I've carefully looked at this, having lived in Canada for a while now. And I talked about this before, even on the podcast. There's a discrepancy between what people really want compared to what the ruling party or even the media wants. Like, for instance, when I hear someone like Justin Trudeau, and sorry, I'm going to reference politics here. I know I wanted to really avoid politics. It's really hard to avoid politics. When someone like Justin Trudeau says there's a clash of affordability versus the immediate need to protect the environment and fight climate change, I thought that was lunatic to say, for instance. And he referenced at one time saying Canadians wake up with the thought of climate change as high priority on their mind. And I said, no, that's not me. When I'm going to work, I'm not thinking climate change. Yes, I think climate change. I think protecting the environment as I operate my day-to-day business. But that's not the first thing that occurs to me in the morning. Maybe it occurs to Justin Trudeau and his cabinet. I don't know, and I really don't care, actually. But the fact is, I am thinking about my economic prosperity. I'm thinking about value for my time in my day and what I get out of it. And I think that's the way most of the friends that I have, I think, most of the immigrants who came here for economic opportunities, that's the way they think. And that discrepancy could not be more jarring than what I've seen recently.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say is I think there are chunks of the Canadian population who do think about climate change when they get up in the morning. So I think I would just caution you to say Canadians don't agree on that. What I think you're speaking to is how the world has changed in 2025 from 2015 when Trudeau got elected. I don't think we're living in the same world. And one of the ways we're not living in the same world, the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have, at the base of this pyramid, you've got shelter, food, basic physical needs for safety, or no one's going to beat you up or rape you or whatever it is. And the more you move up the hierarchy, you get to more, at the very top of it, things about self-fulfillment and your values, and you're worried about the costs of progress and the costs of economic growth, right? And the things that political scientists call post-materialist values, right? It's a fancy word of saying things we'd like to be true about the world and would make us happier people and societies. But so long as these other needs are secure. And we live in a world in 2025 where these other world needs are not secure. And that's what's happened from 2015 to 2025. We're living in a less safe world where our economic prosperity isn't certain. Internationally, where, the prospect of a third world war is not imminent, but not a crazy idea.
Right.
And where, there are a whole host of ways, obviously we've just been through this period of inflation after COVID. Even though inflation is reduced, the cost of food is still so high and housing is still so high that, saying the inflationary number is down doesn't really mean anything to a lot of Canadians, because the cost of living is still way too high to begin with, right? And our salaries are lower. And by the way, the government brought in all kinds of temporary foreign workers, so the salaries aren't going up because the market's not correcting for that, right? So it's not that people might not care about climate change in theory, but we live in a world that the current government just is only very belatedly and very reluctantly admitting exists, right? And it's not coincidental that the Liberal Party's turned on a bunch of these issues. They didn't want to do it because I don't think it reflects their main values, but they've just seen the polling, they've seen the incredible transformation in Canada, and so they're reluctantly and belatedly coming around to this.
They often blame this on COVID. Could we blame this on COVID, or you think it's inherently a policy issue even prior to COVID?
Blame what on COVID? Sorry, what do you mean?
Like, you're talking about the fundamental needs in life, say housing, shelter,
Yeah.
that's being threatened right now. We could say in part we blame it on having gone through a global pandemic. But you're referencing 20.
Yeah, I don't think it's just the pandemic. It's obviously partly the pandemic played a role in exacerbating some of these issues. But the housing crisis in Canada was building for a long time. Certainly, some of the things the government did around changing immigration levels happened kind of just after COVID. But the international situation, the turn in the U.S. towards more isolationism, really gets started in 2016 when Trump won is elected. This is a longer term trajectory, and the Trudeau government federally has been in power throughout that, and they've been hanging on. But the Trudeau government was sort of like an Obama era type leader, and that was fine in 2015, and it's not fine in 2025.
So what do you think about a nation protecting national interest primarily? First of all, you call that in passing just now, isolationism, struggling to say that word. We saw that since 2016, you said, in Trump's era. But what do you think about a nation protecting national interest first and primarily versus other interests that we've seen of late, again, through liberal policies like international generosity and bringing in a lot of immigrants who necessarily are not economic immigrants adding economic value in the moment to the nation.
The Trudeau government, if it can be blamed for anything, should be blamed for the insult it did to the idea of Canada. The way in which speaking of Canada and being proud of Canada is something that, even though Trudeau sometimes speak of Canadians, a certain version of Canada as multicultural and diverse and respectful of progress, he'll speak proudly about that. But when he's in front of a different group or at a different moment, he's continuously emphasizing the evils of Canada and the horrors of Canada. That's a cultural thing, but I think what that shows you is it's a government that was kind of embarrassed about saying Canada had interests and that those should come first, right? Canada had economic interests, then that those should come first. That Alberta's economy, right, incredible place it played in the national economic interest. You could ignore that because they had other kinds of values that they wanted to prioritize. And so there's the way in which the cultural idea of Canada that Trudeau was continuously apologizing for, even going so far as to say that agreeing that Canada in the 2020s was experiencing ongoing genocide. Like, this is a prime minister who said there was ongoing genocide in this country. It's a kind of ludicrous idea. He was a guy who did not fundamentally have Canada's back unless it represented a very particular, narrow vision of Canada.
And we need to begin to wrap up slowly. Let's talk about one more thing before I get to the final point I want us to talk about. The final one is actually very important, but we get there in a second. I picked this from your article. You criticized someone like Mark Carney, for instance. I'm just going to read this portion of your article. The challenge for any new national liberal leaders is just to distance him or herself from Justin Trudeau. Though that will be hard enough, the task is also to offer fresh energy and tap into the actual concerns of Canadians. So why on earth, after 10 years of liberal rule, should voters go back to the same old bowl of soggy cereal? Why do you use that tag for?
I suppose it partly builds off what I was just saying. I think the challenges of 2025 are the challenges of Canadian safety, Canada's economic interests, and also to a certain extent about learning that to grow the Canadian economy, it's not about for a government to go and subsidize a new electric battery power plant. I just think the Trudeau government's main approach, and the Liberals have generally been about this, is about to get the government involved in sponsoring things and regulating issues. And I think the economic challenge of Canada is to get the government out of the way and to kind of support and foster incredible competition and dynamism in Canada's economy with some fresh ideas. And I'm not the best person to come up with all those ideas, but a government that's been in power for coming up to 10 years now is not going to be a source of great new ideas usually.
So you think if the Liberal Party would stand a chance in the current election cycle, or maybe even in the next few, they should be looking outside the current crop of leaders that they have there? What do you think?
I think obviously Mark Carney, seems to be the most popular of all the candidates so far, and probably be for that very reason, right? And he is, all the leadership candidates mostly are turning their backs on the main policies of the Trudeau government, right? On, say, things like the carbon tax. They're trying to make that not an issue. And they're trying to pretend that wasn't, a major, incredible reversal. I think the dilemma for them, and they might succeed in doing this, is the dilemma for them is to say that they actually, I think what's needed in Canada is a fundamentally different approach to growing the economy, to supporting, Canada's interests, to thinking Canada does have interests, thinking Canada does have a proud history. Why would you believe that this government, which has been against all those things, or at least a way of supporting all those things, why would you trust them to change their minds all of a sudden?
Yeah, but you can't trust the same government, but the same government called the conservative weird. You talked about it in one of your
Yeah.
articles as well. What's weird about conservatives?
Well, that's a whole different article. But this was in the summer when people were trying to say that was Republicans were weird, and I suppose there I was trying to say that. Well, let me put this a different way. Another way for the Liberals to win is to scare Canadians that conservatives are too frightening. That and this worked for Trudeau very effectively in 2019 and 2021. That on issues like guns or abortion or various other other issues that you could scare them. They're not really Canadian in this kind of way. And that could be an effective way of still scaring off Canadians against conservatives, because in the current kind of cultural landscape, conservatives have seemed like they're not really Canadians. I think something has switched there. I think there's been a shift in our political discourse that is going to make that less convincing now, but we'll have to see.
Well, one of the reasons why we heard such sayings, if I could say rhetoric, in the summer even from the United States, right? Calling Trump weird, calling and in reverse they call someone like Tim, what was his name again? Tim, the vice presidential candidate,
Oh,
Tim Walz.
Tim Walsh.
Yeah, they in return called him weird as well. The whole weird thing was going on, but a key thing I kept hearing, and then this is connected with some of your articles that I read as well. The key point I kept hearing from the Liberal Democrats in the States, for instance, which I'm starting to hear as well in Canada, is that we're not going back. I listened carefully, even looking at the Democratic Convention in the States, and even looking at the primaries or the local selection for the Liberal leader right now. There's an issue of we're not going back to the what do you call them, the corporate oligarch that they often blame conservatives about, and issues about social values as well. The progressives want to move on different social issues. You alluded to that in some of your article. So how do we navigate that?
I think that it can be an effective argument if you think that not agreeing with a series of modern day progressive values is somehow reactionary, right? And that's what they're depending on you to believe. I think it's kind of an inaccurate claim that on a whole host of social issues, the progressive orthodoxy has gone so far to the left and so far away from what I think many Canadians, if they hear what the actual issues involved, would agree with, whether on just a whole range of things. If you can believe what the Pierre Poilievre is saying, and you might want to distrust him, he's a politician, you can believe what you want, but he's not going to backtrack on a whole host of things about the rights for gays and lesbians and gay, same-sex marriage. He's not going to revisit the abortion debate on a whole host of things that I think where the polling shows that many Canadians, not all Canadians, but many Canadians are on side. I don't think a current conservative government under Poilievre would change any of those things. But on more controversial issues around, are there two sexes or two genders, and there's whole issues around those things, then there's all this kind of more debate. And I think the current liberal government, like the Democrats in the U.S., want to play this bait and switch. They want to say, it's a turn back to this crazy reactionary times, and that if you vote conservative or vote Republican, you're going to get this crazy reactionary. I don't want to speak about the U.S. because I think Canada's very different. Right. But in the Canadian case, it's not at all clear to me, and to me not a very convincing argument, that a conservative government under Poilievre would in any way represent that. I think it's more accurate to say that on a host of very contemporary, very controversial issues where the progressives have tried to shut off even any debate on things, that the conservatives would disagree with a lot of kind of more radical progressive orthodoxy. And so if by going back, you mean going back to 4 years ago, then probably they're right.
In the argument for social issues and the way the progressives look at it versus someone like even Pierre Poilievre, I've been seeing some of his arguments about these issues of late. I know you've talked about the issues with the weight projected about victimhood in our current culture under the current administration, victimhood and issues about you talked about this in your article as well, that we've actually replaced, and this is not even a problem with the current argument, it's not a problem with the current government, that we've replaced issues or topics about prayers in schools with land acknowledgement, and it's become a little sacrament that we repeat now. A guilty conscience thing. That's the way you refer to it in your article. But all of those reversible in our culture. And is it really helping our culture? And if it's not helping, are they reversible under a new administration, especially without sounding like you're lunatic, like the way Trump is going about it right now?
Yeah. And I think the Canadian way would not be a certain section of Canada would present Poilievre as like Trump, but my sense is he's not like that. I think he expresses himself as someone who wants to get government out of people's faces. And it's going to be sold as reactionary and conservative. But what he's saying is he's actually open to individual freedom, as far as I read him. Whether he governs that way indifferently is a different matter. And what he threatens is a host of kind of experts and progressive believers who want to actually put government in your face and say you can't question if there are two sexes or not, or you're worried about what's being taught in your schools, or you worry, certain things that are off topic for debate. And I think Poilievre represents a section of the Canadian public who would like to say, get out of the way. Governments get out of the way. Stop telling us what to do. It's the school system. Stop politicizing subjects. And this isn't about any one party or not. It's about two kind of foundation values. Do you believe in people being having the right to free speech, having the right to maybe offend, and also the right to call a spade a spade? And a large section of kind of the cultural expert class finds that very threatening because they want to control the way people think and the way people speak.
So let's go back in history a little bit here. You're a historian. Is there any time in history, some of the guests I've had on the podcast talked about Jean Cartier. It made me go back to read about him, actually. But is there any time in history that you think represents where we're at right now, that the next government could glean wisdom from?
All right. Interesting. So there's two answers come to mind.
Okay.
On the one hand, on cultural politics, I think we've been living through a Victorian age, which is to say, if you think of the Victorians in the kind of the mindset, in some ways in real life, they were incredible moralists who wanted to stop you from thinking about sex and the body. And they do editions of Shakespeare, and they take all the kind of vulgar references out of it because they weren't supposed to think about that. And the contemporary kind of woke activists have tried to do the same thing, but for unacceptable ideas about their different individual identity groups. People haven't thought in exactly 21st century ways about this. Well, we can't have our kids read those books. So in some ways, we've been living through a Victorian age. I think in some ways, although still with important differences, we're living through the 1970s in a certain extent. Incredible economic crisis. The old ways of doing things are ossified. We've had too much regulation. We've had, essentially this incredible growth of government, and we need to get rid of government. And, that's why across the Western world, you get this kind of anti-regulation approach. I think there are differences with that era. I wouldn't want to go too far with that, but I certainly think the solution to a lot of our problems on issues of culture, on economy, certainly in terms of like the way in which the courts are inhibiting Canadians' abilities to live on safe streets and crime-free neighborhoods, or neighborhoods where criminals actually get arrested and actually stay behind bars. You need to kind of this anti-regulation approach. You need to get rid of all these things that are restricting the economy from growing, restricting police from being able to do their jobs, restricting Canadians from living the way they want to live.
Let me ask you one question on that too. So I noticed that there is a different relationship between Canadian political leaders and global organizations, like if you talk about the United Nations or World Economic Forum. There are 3 key Canadians on the website of the World Economic Forum, for instance, and I looked into other nations. Compare with American leadership, for instance. There's no direct leadership in American politics that is in the World Economic Forum. But we have in Canada, you have Jagmeet Singh, you have Justin Trudeau, you have Christopher Dummitt, who are currently on the website. I say this also because it's a topic that comes up a lot on the street. Doing YouTube podcasts.
It's a trend lately to think the World Economic Forum is kind of behind a lot of global issues.
Right. How much of conflict of interest do you think that represents in our government?
I'm not, maybe I'll upset you or your viewers, I'm not a big believer in the kind of, at least some versions of the conspiracy theory of the World Economic Forum. I would explain it more as, a confluence of a shared vision of the world. I think Trudeau and Freeland and Jagmeet Singh are, believers in a kind of idea of a global citizenship, that you're a citizen of the world. Trudeau's father had, when he went to university in the US, poster on his wall or on his door said citizen of the world, right? He comes by it naturally. That's how he thinks about the world. That's why he's a Canadian, but he's a proud Canadian as long as what it means to be Canada is to just be a diverse Canadian, and there's really kind of very little idea of Canada itself. So I don't see Trudeau and others, shaping the world through the World Economic Forum. I don't see a lot of evidence for that. But I think that in Canada, they represent a vision of the country which sees Canada working most effectively through international organizations as a foil against the Americans and others to kind of get what they think Canada should have.
There's a very important conversation I would love to have with you. Well, I'm going to schedule it for another time. We're going to see how the public receive this one, and then we're going to come back to it. Maybe it's actually a good idea to come back to it. You were one of the signatories, 40 signatories in academia to warn the Trudeau government about DEI policies. I know this is a totally different conversation on its own. It ties into some of the things we've said, but we're going to come back to it another time. But there's also a repeating trait in conversations that I see when people reach out to me on YouTube. Maybe it's on one hand, it's one of the reasons I like doing this. People connect with me and ask your guest this question. One common recurring theme is all these intellectual conversations are great. Talking about politics is kind of emotionally satisfying or emotionally stressful to some other time. But the key thing that people keep asking is, what do I do?
What do I do? What does any individual do?
Right. Like to the average Canadian, myself, people out there, who feel sabotaged after a government gets into office, and they have to wait for that 4-year period and constantly getting frustrated about their lives, about the future. What's the approach?
I mean, there's so many different things you could do. One is actually join a political party, right? People think the political parties are out there and they're just already exist pre-formed, but actually you can just join a political party and you can get your friends to join the political party, and then you can control the political party. You can control who gets voted at the local nomination race.
Right.
Like, so fundamentally important.
Right.
That's one thing. And I also think if you believe, I'm assuming many people who watch this video are concerned about the way in which we can talk about Canadian politics has been constrained. Even opposing an issue like DEI, maybe a little bit less so now, but certainly it seemed like this is something you just can't say. Certainly by someone of my skin complexion, you're just accused of all these horrible things, which in my case, I'm not, but I think the key thing is that you just need to kind of openly and calmly and not by losing your temper, speak out and speak, as some people say, speak your truth. The more critics that are out there, the easier it is for others to speak.
Right. And what I find also is that the loud group does not necessarily mean the right group, or
And one of the features about social media and how it shapes our vision of what's real is that it makes the poles seem more common than they are, right? So it seems like there are more people on the extremes than there really are, and that's a feature of the algorithm. It's not true.
right. So speaking about that, I have an engineering background. I do engineering. When you talk about the distribution of a normal distribution, I don't know if this is something you're familiar with. If you have a set of data that's normally distributed, which has a peak around the mean,
Yeah, and then it kind of fades out
when
to
you
it.
say get out, in the ends, in the tails of that distribution, you actually find the loudest noise there because it's further away from the center.
Yes.
So one of the things I found in comparison to this of late is that the noises from the end necessarily might not represent where a lot of people belong.
Yeah.
That's what I find. But you mentioned that political participation. I think that's a very good point. What about the issue with restoring like intellectual diversity into conversations? Wouldn't that be very important as well as a way forward?
I mean, that's part of what I'm trying to do. Obviously, I'm a tenured full professor at a Canadian university, so it's pretty hard, not impossible, but pretty hard to fire me. I often take views which, in the university world, I don't think outside the university world very much, but in the university world are considered to be quite controversial. But I think it's my role to represent a series of voices of opinions that I think are pretty common in large sections of Canada, but which aren't represented in the university world, which aren't represented in parts of our kind of intellectual culture. I wish, and I like when there are more people who represent different viewpoints, and I wish there were even more of them.
Right, right. Do you believe in the future of the Canadian as being bright? I mean, the Canadian future.
Yeah, depends on what time of the day you get me.
What time is it now?
Yeah,
How do you see the future?
it's long since my morning coffee, so I'm slightly more pessimistic now, and I need lunch, so maybe I'm more pessimistic now.
All right, good. Well, it's really good talking to you, Dr.
You too, yeah.
Yeah, hopefully we get to have another conversation another time.
Okay,
But I appreciate this opportunity. Yeah. Did you have a good time chatting about this?
I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Revaluate is a project I embarked upon to spark meaningful conversations that can inspire critical thinking as we navigate the adventures of life. The analytics on this channel show about 95% of the viewers on the channel haven't subscribed yet. So you do me a favor by clicking the subscribe button right now. Then I'll keep my promise to continually improve on the quality of the conversations that are produced on this channel every time.